Using Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication is a secure way to manage access to your Azure SQL database. To get started, you need to create an Azure Active Directory tenant and configure it with your Azure SQL database. First, go to the Azure portal and navigate to the Azure Active Directory section. Create a new Azure Active Directory tenant or use an existing one. Then, create a new user or group that will be used to authenticate with your Azure SQL database. Next, navigate to the Azure SQL Database section and select your database. Click on the Active Directory Admin option and select the Azure Active Directory tenant you created earlier. Then, select the user or group you created as the Active Directory admin. To connect to your Azure SQL database using Active Directory Authentication, you will need to install the Azure Active Directory Authentication library for your preferred programming language. You can then use this library to authenticate with your Azure SQL database using the user or group credentials you created earlier. When connecting to your Azure SQL database, you will need to specify the Active Directory authentication method and provide the tenant ID, client ID, and client secret. You can obtain these values from the Azure portal. Best practices for using Azure SQL Active Directory authentication include using least privilege access, regularly rotating credentials, and monitoring authentication logs for suspicious activity. It is also recommended to use Azure Active Directory groups to manage access to your Azure SQL database, rather than individual users. In summary, using Azure SQL Active Directory authentication provides a secure way to manage access to your Azure SQL database. By following these steps and best practices, you can ensure that your database is protected and that access is limited to authorized users.